So my name is Ratnaprabha. I'm the chair of the trustees here at the North London Buddhist Centre, and I'm one of the team for this class. It's fantastic having a team for this class, so you've probably met some of them. It just makes a difference working together with other people, in the same way of just chatting to somebody in the break, in the same way as it makes a difference when you can meditate together with other people. You know, it's lovely to be able to do it at home with an app or with a lead through on YouTube, but to meditate with others makes such a big difference, I think. But it's not just to do with meditating with other people, it's also to do with connecting with other people who to some extent share your values, or are keen on and interested in the same things. So thanks for coming along. That's what we're doing in a way. We're creating something by being together here. It's not a question so much of an audience or a group of students learning something. It seems to me it's creating something together. So I'm going to be talking in the first talk of our 2023 series, and we're going to have them talk every month. I wanted to talk first of all about a very frightening experience. It wasn't actually my experience. It was the experience of a very well-known person around the turn of the 20th century. So I'm going to see whether you can guess who this was. So this is what they, I won't even tell you what gender they are. This is what they experienced. It was night in some strange place, and I was making slow and painful headway against a mighty wind. Dense fog was flying along everywhere, and I had my hands cupped around a tiny light, which threatened to go out at any moment. Suddenly, I had the feeling that something was coming up behind me. And I looked back and I saw, this is the really frightening bit, I saw a gigantic dark figure following me. But at the same moment, I was conscious, in spite of my terror, that I must keep my little light going through the night and the wind, regardless of all dangers. You probably guessed it was a dream, actually. It wasn't, didn't really happen. But can anyone guess, or you may actually know, you may recognize the dream. Do you know who this was? Any guesses? It was male, not British. Swiss? Does that help?
Jung.
Jung, that is right. It's Carl Gustav Jung. Carl Gustav Jung, the great psychoanalyst. And it was when he was a young student, and this was like a turning point in his life when he had this dream. And in his autobiography, which I'd really recommend, it's called Memories, Dreams, Reflections. In his autobiography, he goes on, when I awoke, I realized at once that the figure was my own shadow on the swirling mists, brought into being by the little light I was carrying. So the shadow is being cast back on the mists and the clouds from that little light. I knew too that this little light was my consciousness, the only light I have. My own understanding is the sole treasure I possess, and the greatest. And though infinitely small and fragile in comparison with the powers of darkness, it's still a light, and it's my only light. I don't know what about you, but it gives me the shivers, that story, in a way. But it's yet such a human story as well. It's so real, I think. And maybe also, has anyone here ever had a dream where there is something chasing you or following you and you don't really know what it is? Yeah, a few hands going up. Yes. And he goes on, he says, this dream was a great illumination for me. And he realized that what was terrifying him was his own shadow, the shadow of the light of his awareness. And that became Jung's life work, in a way, discovering what was hidden in his shadow. He used this term, the shadow, for what was hidden in your psychology, and bringing what's hidden into the light of awareness. And he called that work integration. And integration is the topic I want to look at today in the light of mindfulness. So the shadow is everything about us and the way we behave and what we say, but that's not really acceptable to us, that we want to avoid, everything we can't really face. And very often we project that, as they say, onto other people. We can't stand how inconsiderate so-and-so is. Why are they so inconsiderate? But we don't realize that in another way, we also are inconsiderate and we can't really face that. Or we become unaccountably furious with that person or quietly resentful, or we avoid them completely, but just because they remind us of something that is in that shadow hidden behind us. And it's a great clue when something like this happens, that we've got something to discover, really exciting, about our own shadow. So as well as about integration, about this process of bringing what is unaware into awareness, I want to also talk about meditation. And in fact, I want to talk about the whole of Buddhism. This is a very broad talk, this one, and I hope, especially for those of you who don't know much about Buddhism, I hope it'll give you an idea of how Buddhism works and what it's for. It's about the whole Buddhist path. And Buddhism, as you probably know, fundamentally, what's the basic value of Buddhism? What's most important in Buddhism? It is awareness. It is mindfulness. That's why we're meditating. That little light of consciousness that you cradle in your hands. So mindfulness practice means bringing more and more of your experience, bringing more of your mind, the mind itself, into awareness, making what is unconscious conscious. And this is a really big deal. It's not something you do overnight. It's not something you go to one workshop online and think, oh, good, I've sorted all that out. This is a life's work. It really is. So in a way, Buddhism is quite a big task. Fortunately, you don't have to commit to the whole thing. You can just try the basic mindfulness and see whether it's helpful. But if you really go for the whole Buddhist path, it's daunting. It is daunting, but really exciting as well. So I'm going to talk about how integration works in Buddhism and how it fits into the whole of Buddhism. I'll give an account of the Buddhist path, and I want to particularly explain the 5 phases of Buddhist practice as laid out by my own teacher, Sangharakshita. And then I want to talk about the 5 paths in traditional Buddhism and how these are connected. And these paths, in a way, have been adjusted, you could say, in this particular Buddhist movement, the Triratna Buddhist community, so that they make sense in the current world. But is that a legitimate thing to do? You know, should you take an ancient 2,500-year-old tradition and adapt it, or should you just stick very much with how you find it in the old texts? Should you be faithful to the original? And then I'll go into more detail about the first of these 5 paths, which is the path of integration, or the phase of integration. But I also want to say how that connects with mindfulness, and this is slightly intriguing, how it connects with magical abilities, according to the tradition. And then I'll finish on another great significant dream. So that's what we're looking at today. So what is Buddhism? Let's start off with that. Is it possible to sum up Buddhism in a simple scheme that anybody could understand? The answer is yes. Well, what is Buddhism though? Is it a religion? I was talking to somebody in the tea break about this, and I'm not a religious person. Is Buddhism a religion? Well, it doesn't give away responsibility to an external divine power, but yet it recognizes that we need to open to something far bigger than our own ego. So maybe a religion, I don't know. It's not really a philosophy either, but it does help you to develop a perspective on human life and what really matters. It's not really, some people say, oh, it's a way of life, but that's very narrow to say it's just a way of life, because it does contain a lot of useful tips on how to live, but it's more than just a way of life. And so what did the Buddha say? Okay, let's go back to the founder of Buddhism. What did he say Buddhism was? And he said, it is a middle path, or the middle path. That was his definition. So I'm satisfied with that. Buddhism is a path. And what would happen if you got a really lofty vista and you could look down on the whole path in Buddhism? What would that look like? if you could do that, you'd have a way of understanding the whole of Buddhism and seeing how it fits in with what you need in life, how relevant it is to you, rather than just as an abstract, interesting Eastern tradition. So this system of practice is broad enough to include everything in the Buddhist path. So it really is an amazing way, a framework for understanding things. And it's got 5 aspects, the system of practice, and they cover absolutely everything you need, I would say, for a human journey. I mean, when you look at it, you probably say, well, that's just common sense, it's not really Buddhism. And that often happens when you look at Buddhism, because it doesn't have a lot of very esoteric, weird, religious stuff and so on about it. It often, mindfulness, what's that got to do with following some particular ancient tradition? It's obvious. So, how do you start? You've got to decide really where you're going. You've got to decide whether you're prepared to do what it takes to get there on this path. And to do that, it means, to some extent at least, you need to be one single self-aware person, somebody taking responsibility for your life, having a sense of who you are, even all your different parts, hence integration, even maybe a vague sense at least of what lies in that shadow behind you. So this is the first phase, integration. You need to be a genuine individual. So I'll put this one on shine here, integration, number 1. And what is it you integrate around? You integrate around that little flame, the cradle that you cradle in your hands, the flame of consciousness. You think, well, does that matter to me? Am I prepared to commit to having ever more awareness? Because there are some things in that shadow area that actually, I don't really want to know about that. Not, at least not today, maybe sometime in the future. So it's quite a big deal, to say, yeah, I want to commit to more awareness. Now, a path is like a journey, isn't it, that you're following a path? And when you embark on a journey, especially if it's to a destination you've never been to before, you need at least maybe to know what that destination is called, or have some sense of why you want to get there. And so you need to have something to orient yourself to, and I'll say more about that in a minute. But as you get to know yourself better, as you become integrated more fully, you realize that it's not enough just to be able to explain what is important to you, even to start this integration process. It's not enough to have a theory or an ideology that you've signed up to. You need to care about it. Your heart needs to be in it, doesn't it? And this is the second phase. Caring needs caring about yourself, but also responding to the vastness that I mentioned, this thing that is bigger than your ego, but also caring about other people, wanting to make a difference in this suffering world. So this is the phase of positive emotion. Positive emotion. You realize then that you need to be working on your mind. You need to change the way you respond to what happens to you so that you become emotionally strong, you become confident, but also you become cheerful. It's important to find this. This is why it's emotional positivity. It's not just emotional awareness. It's finding ways of engaging with the world and all the difficulties and the problems of life, but yet remaining reasonably cheerful. The phase of positive emotion. Now, once you're an integrated person to some extent, who really cares, happy about yourself, aware of your amazing potential, confident and strong, what happens next? And the next stage, the third one, may be quite unexpected because it's reversing what you've just done in a way. It's dissolving the sense of the strength, the strong integrated self that you've built up, dissolving the sense of self as a limited, protected center of everything, which you may have needed to strengthen in the first 2 stages in order to be integrated and positive. You may have needed to build up, maybe not your ego so much, but your sense of yourself, your confidence in yourself. But now you let that in a way die. And Sangha actually calls this spiritual death. It's also known as wisdom or insight. It's seeing through to reality, seeing that openness is the reality of human life, not an insistence on being a separate me that can protect itself from everything else. So he called this one spiritual death. So spiritual death is like leaping into that path, into that journey, even though you don't really know who you are or where you're going. It's that excitement of an open horizon ahead of you. But if you're going to make a difference in the world, you don't want to stay dead. This isn't the end point. You don't want to be wandering about in the bardo, as they say in Buddhism. You want to re-emerge in forms that can really help and forms that can really treasure human life and human existence. So as well as letting go of your limited habits and your belief in a separate self, you also cultivate all sorts of qualities. You cultivate all sorts of magical qualities. In fact, this does start to get slightly religious at this stage, you could say, because you start to build yourself up as a Buddha, because everybody is a potential Buddha. That's the basic faith of Buddhism in a way, is that everybody can be awakened. You can achieve this amazing potential of no craving, no hatred, no delusion, but enormous compassion and wisdom that's symbolized by the Buddha, and presumably the historical Buddha embodied that. So this is known as spiritual rebirth. In a way, maybe even rather than recreating yourself as a Buddha, you allow a Buddha or the Buddha to emerge in your space. A Buddha isn't just an empty space where the ego has vanished. The Buddha space is filled with beauty and energy, which is why I think Buddhist artists are trying to depict this, sometimes more successfully than other times, but trying to depict this in the image of the Buddha, a human being, and you can have female Buddhas as well, who is awakened. I mean, very often actually they're non-gendered really, many of the statues, you can't really tell. And I put this one on the shrine here because it's touching the earth, that sense of being grounded, which is said to represent a particular event that happened around the time of the Buddha's enlightenment. That sense of being grounded is very closely connected with integration and mindfulness. So that's 4. Spiritual rebirth is number 4. But I said there were 5 phases. But the 4th one is the last. And because in a way, what more there is there to do? If you recreated yourself, if you emerged into the space of being an awakened being. But the 5th is sometimes called spontaneous compassionate activity. It's what happens when there isn't any more to be done, but yet there's so much to be done. In a way, you're okay, but it's not okay just to be okay when everything else is not okay. So spontaneous compassionate activity, there's much to respond to if you have those qualities of awakening. So you can ask yourself that if you were a Buddha, what path would you be following beyond that point? And that's the path you'd be on, the path of spontaneous compassionate activity. So this is the 5-fold system of practice: becoming integrated, cultivating positive emotion, going through the gateway of spiritual death, emerging into spiritual rebirth, and spontaneous compassionate activity. So if you like things to be sort of neat and sorted and tabulated on a spreadsheet, then this is a way of understanding Buddhism, the whole of Buddhism. Very helpful framework. All Buddhist teachings can be placed in this framework. Noble Truth, Sacred Path, all those things can be placed within it. But there's something more important than getting things neat, because I think it's also a helpful framework if you really want to make practical use of Buddhism in your life. because it tells you the 5 different areas you can work on. And I'm going to come back to that later, because it sounds a little bit like, well, being a spontaneously compassionate person, that's a long time in the future, isn't it, Denise? But no, we can already do all these 5 things. So 5 aspects, a framework for understanding Buddhism, putting them into practice. And this is the way that we've been trained in this particular Buddhist community, the Triratna Buddhist community. And this 5-fold system was taught by my own teacher, Sangharakshita. Because if you think about it, well, you may not realize this, but so integration, positive emotion, these are very much terms from a Western tradition. They're not just straight translations of old Buddhist terms. They are translations, but in a much broader sense, translations of Buddhism. They don't just come sort of singly from the old traditions of Buddhism. But yeah, I would say they are traditional. And the source of the 5 is something called the 5 paths. So according to traditional Buddhism, the path to enlightenment has 5 legs to it, 5 phases. And they're known as 5 paths because each of them is a journey in itself. And they come in particular from what sometimes called Sanskrit Buddhism. So you can switch off now if you like. I'm just going to, for a minute, just give you a little bit of background about Buddhist history and the different schools of Buddhism. So if you're not interested in that, just fiddle with your phone or something. But while I'll just mention this because it's quite interesting. Now, if you've come across Buddhism, you'll probably maybe come across Tibetan Buddhism or Chinese or Japanese Buddhism. These are all forms of what's known as Northern or Mahayana Buddhism. You may have also come across, say, Buddhism from Thailand or Sri Lanka, the forest monks, Cambodia and so on. And this is often known as Southern Buddhism or Theravadan Buddhism. But actually, there are many, many branches of Buddhism. And according to the traditions, at least, not long after the Buddha's death, maybe a couple of 100 years after his death, there were already 18 schools. Now, they weren't squabbling with each other, but they just had different priorities. They'd often even practiced together in the same monasteries, but there were 18 different schools. And one of these schools preserved its teachings in a language called Pali. And that's the one that has survived till this day in Sri Lanka and Thailand and Cambodia and so on. And they've, this wonderful selection of the Buddhist teachings preserved in the Pali language. The other 17 schools, or most of them, preserved their teachings in the Sanskrit language, and another ancient Buddhist or ancient Indian language also used in Hinduism as well. And it's within these Sanskrit schools that you get the 5 paths. So you won't find, if you go to Amaravati Monastery, for example, which is a Theravadan monastery north of London, you won't find the 5 paths there. But because the Mahayana Buddhism, the later forms of Buddhism in Tibet and China and Japan and Korea and so on, they emerged from those Sanskrit forms of Buddhism, so they still have the 5 paths. And it's said to be the basic way that the path of Buddhism is taught in all those schools. So it is definitely traditional in that sense. And in this sense, I'll just tell you the direct translations of what the 5 paths are. We'll see how well they align with integration, positive emotion, and so on. So the first one is known as the path of something like the path of accumulation or collection, the path of gathering, the path of getting set up. And the metaphor here is that if you are setting out on a journey, probably you won't just walk out the door. You'll pack your bags, you'll work out what you need, you'll get prepared. What vehicle is going to get you there? Are you on a bike, for example? Have you got everything in place? Have you got your boots? Have you got your walking poles? Have you got your compass? Have you got your map, your guidebooks? Maybe you need a week or 2 of breaking in the boots as well. Get your muscles ready for the long trip. And central to this path, the path of accumulation, this preparatory path, is mindfulness, very much. And this is equivalent to the phase of integration. It's where mindfulness is your main practice. Mindfulness is a crucial practice all the way through the Buddhist paths, but it's really important to start with mindfulness because otherwise you don't know who you are, you don't know where you're going. In fact, you're probably more than one person in a way. You may not even have fully decided until you've integrated some of your hidden parts. The second path is known as the path of joining, or the path of application. And this is the phase in particular where meditation and the transformation of the mind using meditation becomes the working ground. And this is equivalent to the phase of positive emotion. Because positive emotion, from the Buddhist point of view, means working on your states of mind, encouraging the skillful states of mind, and discouraging the unskillful, the more contracted and more self-oriented states of mind. And that's something which you can only really do in meditation, although other things support it. And then the next path in the 5 paths is known as the path of vision, the path of vision. And vision means insight, vision means wisdom, it means seeing things as they really are, starting to let go into openness, and it's what sometimes is called emptiness, shunyata, and this is equivalent to spiritual death over here. And then the next path, the 4th one, is called the path of transformation. And here you cultivate yourself in the light of your vision. You enter the deepest spaces of the mind, you let your insights transform you completely, and this is equivalent to the phase of spiritual rebirth. And everything is complete, again, and that's traditional, but yet there is a 5th one. And the 5th one here is known as the path of no more learning. So it's when you're still in a way treading a path. Even a Buddha is still changing, still transforming, but it's as if it's all there, it's all to hand. And now you can really engage, as they do say as well, with compassionate activity. So in the path of no more learning is equivalent to spontaneous compassionate activity. So there's a little bit of traditional Buddhism and how that aligns with modern Buddhism. And I think this is a very interesting area here, because the connections are not exact. It's not simply that Sangharakshita, when he came up with this scheme, thought, well, I'll call the path of accumulation, I'll call it integration, because that's a concept that Westerners are familiar with. It's a little bit more to it than that. The path is the same, but the demarcation lines of these 5 phases are slightly different. So, for example, positive emotion, the first thing that positive emotion starts with is working to encourage skillful states of mind and to discourage unskillful states of mind. But in the 5-path scheme, that's included in the first path. It's not very important, is it? But it's just interesting, there's a slightly different place where the dividing line is put, probably for quite good reason, in that we have so much work to do on integration that let's not include too many other things in with it. And the second path is primarily meditation in the traditional scheme, including what's called as calm and insight meditations. While the insight meditations are really part of spiritual death in our scheme. It's not very interesting, that actually, is it? But I just thought I'd sort of, in case you're interested in the way things fit together, and you may have some knowledge of Buddhism, there is that area of how things align. Where do these teachings come from? Which I always find really fascinating to know that. So we're going to go through, over the spring, we're going to go through these 5 phases. Vajramitra, over here, we'll be talking about positive emotion. In February, and then in March we've got Karuna Gita, another really fine teacher. She'll be talking about vision and so on. We've got then another one in April, another one in May. So is it legitimate, though? Just let's look at that. Is it legitimate to mess around with an old tradition like Buddhism? Is that, if you do, how do you do it? What does it mean? Well, actually, Buddhism has always messed around. So Buddhism evolves. It evolves to meet the needs of the cultures that it encounters. And unlike some religions, it's not an ideologically based religion with a sacred text. The problem with a sacred text that is said to be divinely revealed is that then you will tend to get some followers, not all, but some followers of that religion will tend to be fundamentalists. And they will say, this is unquestionable. It's there in black and white. It's there in Arabic or in Greek, in the case of the New Testament, I think, and so on. And there it is. You cannot question it. Nothing about that can be adapted, because there it is. And that's where you go to as your source of authority. But you don't have that in Buddhism. What is the source of authority in Buddhism? The source of authority in Buddhism is spiritual death, or the phase of vision, the path of vision. Because the path of vision is the authority of your real own experience, and your experience trumps anything that comes from anybody else. And that experience can deepen until it reaches that non-ego stage of spiritual death. When it's there, it's reliable. And so as long as we've got some people around, at least have some contact with that phase, then they can adapt Buddhism. Very risky idea though, of course, because how do you know that they do have contact with that phase? You've got to decide whether you can trust your teachers, to what extent you can. And you can't trust them entirely. They may make mistakes, they get it wrong, but then it can evolve again. It never should be stuck. It never should be sort of set in stone. So Sangharakshita, as my teacher and the founder of this movement, he in a way is a translator, but he's translating in a broader sense. He's saying, well, let's look at the whole Buddhist path. Let's get a real sense of what it's about. Now let's divide it into stages that seem to work in a modern context. Okay, now I want to go a bit more now into the stage of integration, the path of accumulation. And you remember I said this is when you're gathering the equipment that you need for the journey in order to set out. So what's the starting point of that process? The starting point is the arising of a focus to integrate around. And I mentioned that focus is that little candle that you're carrying, the awareness. But your focus may be something a bit more specific than that. You may be, where is your energy going at the moment? Maybe it's, I don't know, campaigning for a Labour victory in the next election. It might be climate activism, it might be Black Lives Matter. It might be something like that where, in a way, there's something that is really important to you that you want to give your energy to. But all of these things, which may or may not be great, but they are a little bit too limited to represent a sort of a myth for your whole life, which is what you need. So from a Buddhist point of view, what you integrate around, as well as just saying awareness in general, is what's called the refuges, Buddha, Dharma, Sangha. The possibility of awakening, the path to awakening, and the community that's following that path. And this means making a commitment to unfolding your potential as a human being. That's what Buddhism is trying to do. All of your potential, that is. And so in the tradition, the first path, the path of accumulation, which is equivalent to integration, is said to start with this. It starts with two things, in fact. It starts with a strong sense that just the ordinary aims of life don't ultimately work. So just getting a better career and more money and getting cars and possessions, or even just your family, just your nation, all these things won't ultimately work as sources of deep satisfaction. They may be important, but you need something deeper and more true than that in a way. And also, as well as this sort of disaffection with thinking that ordinary goals can give you sense in your life, full sense, there's also the pledge to work for awakening for everybody's sake. And this is called the Bodhi mind. So the disaffection is the turning away, the Bodhi mind is turning towards with compassion. And this beginning, this starting point of having something to focus around is what leads into the rest of the path of integration. And traditionally, the path of accumulation, what is under that? First of all, 4 mindfulnesses. And then secondly, 4 efforts to be skillful, which I've moved into positive emotion, as I say, so we won't talk about those today. And thirdly, 4 bases of magical power. I promised I'd say the whole about magic, wouldn't I? So that's coming up in a minute. So the 4 mindfulnesses, first of all. What is it that you need to be mindful of? And when the Buddha taught mindfulness, he was very keen to say, start with your body, start physically. So when Shantisara was teaching mindfulness of breathing, She went into a scan of the body first of all. And if you can do at least a little bit of that before you meditate, it's very, very important. So when you're doing mindfulness practice, mindfulness is embodied, it's real, it's touching the earth, it's grounded, it's solid. But also this mindfulness of body means being mindful of your health, your energy, and what helps with your health and your energy. And then secondly, there are the feeling responses. The Buddha said, be mindful not just of your body, but also of what your experience feels like. What's the flavor of it, which is constantly changing. So you might be sitting here and think, oh, it's a bit warm in here, isn't it? You know, or it's a bit cold in here. And you'll have an instinctive feeling of maybe closing in because you're cold or something. And those instinctive, immediate feelings, immediate flavors of experience is the second of the foundations of mindfulness. And then you've got your mood, your state of mind. Very important to be mindful of that. The process of integration means that you need to accept, I am in a particular mood. And that's what's going on with me today. And I think this took me a long time to realize this, and I still haven't fully, that I'm getting bad-tempered. And I think it's because everybody else is being really inconsiderate. And then when it's happened the third or fourth time in the day, I think, hang on a minute, I'm in a bad mood, aren't I? Do you know what I mean? So I think this is really important that you understand your own mental states and your moods. And then also just being mindful, this is the most difficult one, being mindful of everything that pops up into your awareness, all the mental events, all the phenomena in your awareness. But not just being mindful of them, but in a way having a sense of their significance, what they deeply mean, what they're telling you. So getting physical awareness of yourself, practicing with your breath, integrating your instincts, your conditionings, knowing your nature to some extent, knowing your animal nature, realizing we are animals in a way and we have all those instincts, knowing your family conditioning, your cultural conditioning, understanding what kind of character you are. These are all aspects of integration, understanding yourself. And it's not an easy process, this, but it is also a very rewarding process to get to know yourself better. Being also a moral agent, taking responsibility, saying, yes, I'm not just being blown around by the winds, I'm actually able to take responsibility for what happens and how I respond to things. And maybe also discovering your own myth. I've said that you can integrate around the idea of commitment or going for refuge in Buddhism, but in a way that's too general. And maybe you need to find out what is my myth? What is my vision for my life, for myself? And it might be something like art, it might be a particular vocational career, but it might be something intangible that you can never really tie down, the myth of your life. So this organizes all the aspects of your volition so that they form a single stream, a container that you need that's big enough, deep enough to receive all of you as you unfold. And when you're in touch with this, you're in what's called flow, a sense of flow or absorption, which happens especially sometimes in meditation. Okay, I haven't got long to talk about the magic bits now, but I better put that in. So when this path was originally taught, I mentioned that it's not just the 4 foundations of mindfulness, it's also the 4 bases of magic mind power. The 4 bases of magic mind power. And until I was preparing for this talk, I'd never really studied these properly. It's a Buddhist list. Buddhism is full of lists. The 4 bases of magic mind power are, first of all, they're all concentration on something. So first of all, concentration on your desires or your aspirations. Then concentration on enthusiasm and vigor. Then concentration on the power of a focused mind. And then concentration on a penetrative investigation of what's happening in your mind. And it sounds, maybe these are just straightforward mental abilities, aren't they? Concentrating on vigor, on desire, and so on. But according to Buddhism, they are magical. That's the word it uses. Riddhi is the word. But it is amazing what the mind can do if it is sufficiently focused, if it's concentrated. And the Tibetans say, for example, that if these 4 bases of magic are strong enough, then you can mentally travel to distant galaxies to hear the Buddha's teaching in other universes or other solar systems. Now, I don't know, maybe you take that literally. What I'd say, what does that mean? And what it means is that if you have the desire, the energy, the focus, the penetration, you can hear teachings everywhere. You don't have to come to a Buddhist center. You don't have to pick up a Buddhist book. The teachings are there in your surroundings. But you need this kind of focus in order to notice them. So think of the plane trees out there on Highbury Fields. And imagine you're standing in front of one of those wonderful big trees, and then you imagine the roots going down deep into the ground beneath the grass. That is a teaching. How much of you is underground like tree roots? Can you let that nourish you? Active, even in a dark January when all the leaves have fallen off, can you let the roots be alive? So that's just an example of the kind of thing that you may notice as you look around you, as you live your life, the teachings that are everywhere. Okay, we're nearly done. And to summarize the themes in this talk, do you remember we started with Jung's dream of the terrifying dark figure chasing him as he strove to protect the little candle cradled in his hands? And how he came up with his sense that we all have a shadow and that we need to integrate it. And then I talked about integration and the Buddhist path, the 5 phases of the system of practice: integration, positive emotion, spiritual death, spiritual rebirth, compassionate activity. And then the 5 paths in traditional Buddhism, how they connect, how they've been adapted in modern Buddhism in a way. And then I did more on integration and mindfulness and the magical abilities. So following this path, as I said earlier, it sounds like a stage-by-stage journey, but you don't leave behind integration and positive emotion when you reach the deep insights of spiritual death. And in fact, there is a genuine danger there, and it happens sometimes even with great Buddhist teachers. They may have deep insights, but that may lead them to feel that they're above ordinary human decency and kindness. They may have bypassed these very necessary early paths because of strong spiritual death experiences, for example. So our own founder, Sangharakshita, for example, he was prone to sexual misconduct. And I think maybe that's a sign of missing out on those early paths. So the 5 phases need to be present all the time. You need to care about being aware and being mindful. You need to notice when you're scattered, when you're dull. You need to cultivate that awareness. That's the tool of integration. You also need to find a cheerful, a responsive way of living, noticing your state of mind, moving in the direction of greater warmth, away from constriction and tension. And that's positive emotion. You need to be open to all the amazing insights and learnings that are available every day. And each insight is a challenge to old assumptions, old habits, and it's a form of spiritual death. You also need to live as best you can from the deepest and most open side of yourself, allowing the changes of spiritual rebirth. And all of these aspects can become willful and unbalanced, so you need a 5th factor of receptivity, spontaneity, allowing life to flow in its own compassionate way, allowing yourself to learn to be kind. And the basic awareness itself moves on from being a light into being maybe a breeze, a benign breeze that eases you along the path. And I can't say much about him here, but there was a very great Chinese Buddhist called Hsuang Tsang. Now, Hsuang Tsang is the hero of a Chinese novel written in the 1500s, which is known as The Journey to the West. I don't know if anyone's come across it. There was a TV series that's been filmed and so on. Does anybody know what that refers to? There's a particular animal at the centre of the story.
Panda?
No, not a panda. It's a monkey. Yeah, so it's the story of Monkey and Sandy and Pigsy and Tripitaka, who's the monk, and that's Hsuang Tsang. So Hsuang Tsang was a great monk and translator, and he had a dream And in this dream, he thought he'd woken up, like he sometimes do, but he didn't, he was still dreaming. And he felt a longing to climb this immense mountain that he saw in front of him. So he set off for the mountain. So yeah, this is a good idea of the journey, the path, isn't it? Set off for the mountain until he came to a vast sea. He managed to swim across the sea, despite the sharks and the waves. And then he got to a ledge around the mountain. But the mountain was too steep and it was too slippery to climb it. And he was in despair. He was wailing. He was, I want to get up this mountain and I can't. And then he realized that a strong and persistent wind had arisen behind him and was blowing him up the mountain to the summit. And so, encouraged by this dream, he left China. He went on this huge journey, not across the ocean actually, but across the deserts and the mountains, thousands of miles, to take him to India, to go to Nalanda University, to pick up the Buddhist teachings from there. And he became an enlightened master as a result of these experiences.